Today we will learn and reflect on the latest book by the Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Kertzer, The Pope at War, reflecting on how Pope Pius XII sought to lead the Catholic Church through the difficult years of World War II from behind enemy lines. Soon after Cardinal Pacelli was crowned Pope Pius XII, the Nazis blitzkrieged across Poland. In our prior video, we reflected on the difficult early years of the war when the Axis powers were on the march across Europe. Most expected the Nazis would invade England and the war would soon end with Nazis triumphant across Europe. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in our PowerPoint script posted to SlideShare. Please we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Our thumbnail says that when the Allied powers won the war, this was a victory for democracy. And you might have questioned the famous photograph of the Yalta Conference, where Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin were seated together. Now, what does Stalin have to do with democracy? These were the very same questions that were on the mind of Pope Pius XII and many Catholics who worried that Russia and communism would seize control of continental Europe once Hitler was defeated. We must remember that Stalin did agree that free elections would be held in Eastern Europe, but when the communists lost the elections, Stalin changed his mind. So when do the Italians first realize that Mussolini and Hitler might possibly lose the war? And our beloved author gives us a hint exactly halfway through his book, The Pope at War, when, late on the night of October 22, 1942, wave after wave of British bombers swooped below the clouds over Genoa, Italy, and released hundreds of bombs. And later, Milan and Turin would also be bombed. Soon after, Rommel's Africa Corps would be defeated and American soldiers waded ashore in North Africa in Operation Torch. So what was the primary concern of the Church during World War II? The very survival of the Church, of course. The Pope became very worried when in early December 1942 he learned that a London broadcast threatened that the Allies would bomb Rome. The Pope inquired through diplomatic channels whether FDR would spare Rome. An American official repeated the British question: had Pope Pius XII protested when London was bombed by the Nazis? Now, England was a Protestant nation and unsympathetic to the Pope, but FDR had many Catholic voters, so he agreed to spare Rome if Mussolini would move all military activities out of Rome, which he said he would do, but he never did. But the Allies would only bomb the rail yards and airports of Rome. The Vatican would not be bombed intentionally, but some errant explosives would wander into the Vatican City in the confusion that war brings. Now, we ended our prior video with the German forces 15 miles from Moscow in December 1941. The Nazis would get no closer. The winter blizzards had set in, the German tanks were stuck in place, and the Nazi soldiers had inadequate winter clothes and many froze to death. At the beginning of the invasion, the Nazis had 209 combat-ready divisions on the Eastern Front, and this had been whittled down to 58 divisions by March of 1942. The next year, facing fuel shortages, the Nazi armies raced to capture the vast oil fields at Baku, but Stalingrad stood in the way. We've heard about the horrors of Stalingrad, two evil empires with no regard for casualties, forcing its soldiers to fight at gunpoint, shooting them if they dared to retreat, with incredibly savage urban warfare on both sides. Soldiers shooting at each other through holes in walls and floors in ruined buildings. The stories of Stalingrad are legendary. Civilians and women taking up arms to fight the invaders. Snipers sniping hundreds of soldiers. Some Soviets hurriedly manufacturing tanks in the Stalingrad factories, rolling them off the assembly line directly into battle. There were millions and millions of casualties in 5 months of brutal combat, ending in Nazi surrender. And after Stalingrad, the Nazis were in retreat. Kertzer reports news of the Axis debacle at Stalingrad, the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa, and the Allied bombing raids on Sicily, together with the worsening food shortages, with meat, dairy products, bread, pasta, and much else in short supply, was fast eroding support for the fascist regime. Plus, everyone was asking, would the Allies invade Sicily or Sardinia? And would the Allies then invade Italy? And the Pope and all in the Vatican had a more long-term worry. If the Russians defeated Germany, would continental Europe be conquered by the communists? And something else the Italians are worried about. Look at this American Sherman tank in conquering Sicily, where the village boys climbed aboard the tank and celebrated. Not a good sign. In reaction to Sicily being invaded, Mussolini's deposed. In early May, British bombers did fly over Rome, But instead of dropping bombs, they dropped flares and leaflets that threatened Italians with destruction if they did not renounce the Axis alliance. It was the first time Allied planes had appeared in the skies over Rome since the war began. King Victor Emmanuel III and many ranking fascists were concerned. The Allied soldiers who had invaded Sicily were greeted with cheers and flowers from enthusiastic Italians. Mussolini's long-time fascist allies convinced him to call a meeting of the Fascist Grand Council, which had not met in 3 years. The meeting was tense. Many wondered if they'd be arrested and shot. Unexpectedly, one of the members denounced Mussolini at length to his face, and a solid majority voted to return the position of military commander-in-chief to the king. And the next day the king deposed Mussolini, and at his general's urging, had him arrested. Italy's new prime minister was a 72-year-old military man, Pietro Badoglio, who was a key player in many of the atrocities of the Italian campaigns. Now, Churchill was ambivalent about his past as long as he joined the Allied cause. But Badoglio was hesitant to switch sides, because not only was there tens of thousands of German troops in Italy, there was also hundreds of thousands of Italian troops fighting on the Eastern Front. So how could he safely extricate Italy from the war? Badoglio dawdled, but Hitler was resolute. German troops poured across the northern border. There was little Italian resistance. After Badoglio finally signed the Allied armistice, he agreed to have his Italian forces guard Rome's airport so the Allies could land troops to take Rome. But this did not happen. Our author Kertzer does not say why. Perhaps the German troops entered Rome too quickly, or perhaps the Italian troops simply melted away. Kertzer recounts an Italian war diary entry. Our army melted like fog in the sunshine. An army in ruin, without leaders, without arms, without discipline, with really only one wish: not to fight any more against anyone for any reason. Everywhere arms abandoned, camps abandoned, even when facing token German forces. So what happened next? Of course, we know what happened. Germans sent Italian Jews to the death camps. Under Mussolini, the Jews had been persecuted. Many foreign Jews had been rounded up into concentration camps, but Mussolini had very little enthusiasm for the final solution. The Nazis, who occupied Rome for 9 horrible months near the end of the war, were much more enthusiastic about the final solution. Barely 2 weeks after German troops had seized Rome, the orders came to start rounding up the Jews to transport to the death camps. There were few who were willing to help the Jews because, well, the Nazi armies were armed and brutal, and also many devout Catholics held anti-Semitic views, as we saw in our discussion of the Dreyfus affair that tore French politics apart in the interwar years. Kertzer surveys the history of anti-Semitism in Rome. Jews had been living in Rome for over 2,000 years. 4 centuries earlier, when Pope Paul IV first mandated that they be confined in a walled ghetto, locked in at night, 2,500 Jews had lived in Rome. In good part impoverished, they were subject to draconian laws mandated by the popes to keep them in their humble state and to limit all contact with their Christian neighbors. They were further humiliated by the requirement that they regularly attend conversionary sermons at a nearby Catholic church. And he continues, the Jews lived in fear as well that the church authorities would seize their children. Church practice demanded that Jewish children who were baptized, even without the knowledge or consent of their parents, could not be raised by Jews, and so were taken from their families. Under the thumb of the Pope and at their mercy, the Jews in Rome came to be known as the Pope's Jews. And the situation came to an end only with the conquest of Rome by Italian military forces in 1870, and with it the end of the Papal States. Over 1,200 Jews were gathered in the first roundup, and many of them were sequestered a stone's throw from the Vatican, awaiting the arrival of cattle cars at the train station to take them to Auschwitz. And they were without food and without water. Pope Pius XII summoned Weizsäcker, the German ambassador, to protest. And the Pope was primarily concerned with the fate of the Jews who had been baptized as Catholics. And the ambassador said that these converted Jews would be released. And Weizsäcker said that he could do no more, because these instructions came from the highest source, Hitler himself. These Jews were transported directly to Auschwitz. Many of them, including the children, the elderly, the infirm, were sent directly to the gas chambers. A few hundred were sent to the labor camps. Most were worked and starved to death. Less than a few dozen survived the war. Many Jews had escaped the initial roundup. Some simply hid out in friends' houses, suspecting something was up. But now many Jews sought refuge. We know that Pope Pius XII actively discouraged the religious houses in Vatican City from sheltering the Jews. And we also know that over 6,000 Jews were hidden in religious houses across northern Italy, including Rome. Regarding the thousands of Jews sent to their death, Pope Pius judged that it was best to say nothing. Could Pope Pius XII have done more to save the Jews from the death camps? Could the Pope have protested the treatment of the Jews and the Catholic clergy in Poland? And in this sister video, we will reflect on these questions at length, plus another related question. Why did Hitler respect the neutrality of Vatican City when the German troops occupied Rome for 9 whole months? Certainly his troops could have marched into the Vatican and imprisoned the Pope. There was precedent. After all, Napoleon had imprisoned the Pope of his time. Why didn't Hitler simply send the Pope and his cardinals to the death camps at Auschwitz? But at long last, the Allies do liberate Rome and the Vatican. The Allies had landed troops on the mainland near Naples in September 1943, but the Italian mountains were easily defended, and it would be 9 long months before the Allied forces entered Rome. The Germans transported 600,000 Italian prisoners of war for forced labor in Germany. But soon after the Germans advanced, Ernst von Weizsäcker, the German ambassador, assured the Pope that the Germans would respect Vatican neutrality. Learning where Mussolini was being held, Hitler arranged to rescue his fascist friend. Mussolini was being held in a mountain resort. He was rescued by a small contingent of troops led by the famed Oscar Scorzeni, who attacked the hotel. But predictably, the Italian soldiers offered no resistance. Hitler installed Mussolini as the head of the puppet Nazi government, the Italian Socialist Republic, guarded by Nazi troops. But he was more a prisoner than a leader. Mussolini and his lover would be executed by partisans when they tried to flee to Switzerland. Their bodies would swing from the scaffolding of a gas station. Pope Pius XII worried about the chaos that would occur as the American soldiers fought their way into Rome. But, remarkably, Kertzer reports that Hitler himself ordered Marshal Kesselring to prevent Rome from becoming a battlefield. The Germans proposed to the Vatican that Rome be declared an open city, and although the Americans did not agree to do this, this tacit arrangement meant that the German forces simply marched north out of the city. Shortly afterwards, the Americans marched into Rome from the south, sooner than authorized. In his discussions with the American envoy, Pope Pius XII once again expressed his fear that the Russians and communism would dominate post-war Europe. The Pope mistrusted democracy, hoped that the Americans would occupy Italy for a time, and he thought that the monarchy should be restored. And this Catholic fear of democracy would not abate until the bishops convened for the Second Vatican Council several decades later. In sister videos, we will reflect on the wartime experiences of Cardinal Roncalli, the future Pope John XXIII, who called the Second Vatican Council, and Father Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, who wrapped up the Second Vatican Council after Pope John XXIII had died, and how these wartime experiences influenced the decrees of Vatican II. We have a video discussing the secret back channel between Hitler and Pope Pius XII, and a video exploring the question of whether Pope Pius XII should have protested Nazi brutalities more vigorously. And previously we recorded a video examining David Kertzer's World War II history of Mussolini and Pope Pius XI, his predecessor, with some prehistory. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. The histories of David Kertzer read like historical novels. They succeed in bringing you back to the past so you can sense what it was really like to live in those years gone by. David Kertzer is Jewish and also reflected on the history of anti-Semitism, including his well-regarded 2000 book titled The Popes Against the Jews, the Vatican's role in the rise of modern anti-Semitism. But Kertzer is also a fair and skeptical historian, and personally I do not think he has an anti-Catholic bias. The Vatican Press published a criticism of Kertzer's book, but it does not appear to me that whoever was writing this criticism actually read the book, that they were consulting with someone else who provided them with quotes from the book. And this includes criticism of his account from the back channel between Hitler and Pope Pius XII, which is rather embarrassing to the Vatican, although the only accomplishment of these talks was to possibly delay some Nazi persecutions and some Vatican criticism. Kertzer's portrait of Pope Pius XII confirms that he was not naive. The Pope knew that Hitler could not be trusted to comply with the terms of any treaty or agreement. And the Jesuit magazine America has a more balanced review that follows closely with my reflection, and this is from their review. Kertzer suggests that Pope Pius's primary motivation was fear for the Church and Catholics in German-occupied territories if, as he believed until the very end the Axis won, in fear of the atheist communism spreading across Christian Europe if the Axis lost. And it includes this interesting reflection from Marla Stone. She says that the book takes a position between the previous poles of historical interpretation. Previously, the choices were either that Pope Pius XII was Hitler's pope, which is the title of another book, deeply sympathetic to the Nazis, eager for a Nazi-fascist victory, obsessed with the defeat of the Soviets at all costs, and a very dedicated anti-Semite. And the other historiographic position held that Pope Pius XII did everything within his power to help those suffering under Nazi and fascist oppression, and that he was merely constrained by the circumstances. And I personally would agree with her assessment that this book takes a position between these two extremes. Also from the Jesuit America Review, the Reverend Peter Gumpel, the German investigator who promoted Pope Pius's now stalled cause for sainthood, has argued that Pius couldn't speak out more publicly because he knew it would enrage Adolf Hitler and result in more Jews being killed. He cites the case of a Catholic bishop in the Netherlands who spoke out against the deportation of Jews and the Gestapo's response, deporting Jews who had converted to Catholicism. And this review also has an interesting recent account of how scholars were given access to these archival materials. And the picture in the review shows the U.S. envoy to the Vatican, Myron Taylor, meeting with Pope Pius XII. Now, during the war, Pope Pius XII had extensive policy discussions with Myron Taylor, appointed by FDR, who was the first American envoy to the Vatican in history. And these talks are an interesting narrative we did not cover in our short reflections, so we urge you to purchase the book to read this account. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.